Double bill of movies to come tonight on 2. A Love Potion doesn't quite have the desired effect on a young romantic. Shaggy Dog is our Disney movie in 40 minutes. And then Steve Martin proves you can take the mob man out of the big city, but that won't stop the con. Comedy from My Blue Heaven at 9:35. Back to now an examination of UN involvement in the Lebanon in no man's land.
Since 1978, members of the Irish Defence Forces have been trying to keep the peace in Lebanon. For most of that time, there was scarcely a ceasefire, let alone peace. They were caught in no man's land, with the Israeli army and their Christian militia allies on one side, and the PLO and various Shia Muslim resistance groups on the other. The border between Israel and Lebanon. Since the Israeli withdrawal from Lebanon last year, there is an uneasy peace between the two countries. But at least one of the causes of the hostilities that has racked Lebanon and the region for so long is still here. More than 500,000 Palestinians who either fled or were driven from their lands during 50 years of conflict with Israel remain in refugee camps throughout Lebanon. After being forced out of Jordan in 1970, the PLO's armed fighters moved here. In the squalor of the camps, they found many new recruits and became a strong military force. By 1978, after years of civil war, Lebanon had become a dozen different fiefdoms. For a time, the PLO joined Muslims in their battles with the Christians, who had allied themselves with Israel. But their chief enemy was Israel itself, and South Lebanon became the PLO's main base from which to launch attacks on the Jewish state. On the 11th of March 1978, PLO guerrillas hijacked a bus full of passengers near Haifa and headed for Tel Aviv. In the shootout that followed, 28 Israelis and 9 Palestinians were killed. 3 days later, Israel responded. Backed by artillery and airstrikes, 7,000 Israeli troops moved into southern Lebanon to engage the PLO fighters. 4 days later, the UN adopted resolutions 425 and 426, ordering the Israelis out and UNIFIL, the United Nations interim force in Lebanon, in. By June, the Israelis withdrew, but just some of the way, and the first contingents of peacekeepers, which included the Irish, arrived. But by then, South Lebanon was devastated.
Almost the total population of South Lebanon had moved. Women, children, older people, all north as refugees. And the population in South Lebanon was almost nil. Road structure, infrastructure, everything broken down. Water, lights, schools, medical assistance, everything was devastated.
South Lebanon was in chaos. I can remember it all very clearly. It was the aftermath of a very long battle between Palestinian Fatah fighters and the Israelis. The Israelis were moving back, but only to an area which was going to be occupied by them for the next 22 years. UNIFIL was being tasked to go right down to the Israeli border, a function it couldn't fulfill. Southern Lebanon was totally outside government control. It was partly run by Lebanese militias, partly run by the Israelis, partly run by Palestinian guerrillas. It was a chaotic landscape into which the UN, with a mandate drawn up in this lovely big glass building in New York, where they had very little understanding of the position on the ground, the UN had to come and impose some kind of order on this state of absolute anarchy.
For the mandate to work, for peace to be restored, UNIFIL needed the full cooperation of the Israelis and their Christian militia allies and the Palestinians, but they didn't get it.
Go back to the second, please, Well,
all I could say is that I think it could be better on all sides. Cooperation is limited, I think, by the fears and anxieties of the participating parties.
UN Resolution 425 called on Israel to pull back to within its own borders, but it didn't comply.
Well, because we had no other recourse. Had we withdrawn, our security would have been jeopardized. And the first concern of this government was to make sure that its population up north can live a normal life. That is why the government was so insistent at having this border as tranquil as possible by any means.
Our expectations were very great, and as great as our expectations were, our disappointment was even greater, because UNIFIL did not help prevent attacks on the Christians and did not prevent attacks across the border against us.
The mandate under which UNIFIL operates has never been a mandate which gave it enough teeth, enough clout. UNIFIL does give some sort of security, not 100%, I will say between 20 and 25%. The rest is our problem.
By 1982, the Palestinians had regrouped and again began to attack Israel. Prime Minister Begin ordered thousands of troops back into Lebanon. This time, the invasion was to go all the way to Beirut and right through the UNIFIL lines.
I remember very well, just before the really big Israeli invasion of 1982, a press conference given by General Bill Callahan in a village called Ibn al-Saki. And we all thought the Israelis were going to invade, which they did a few days later. And I remember one particularly horrible journalist, and I think it was probably me, asking Bill Callahan, what will you do if the Israelis come rolling over your front lines? And Bill Callahan replied, they will be met with the full force of international opinion.
The first thing I should say is that that is not the first time UN troops have been driven through. They have been driven through in the Sinai, they've been driven through in Cyprus, they have been driven through recently in Kosovo, etc. And if you have been part of one of those, you can understand that when it happens, it's frightening, disappointing, worrying. But it's also that you can be guaranteed there is an end to it, because sooner or later the reverse happens. And it is important for UN not to vacate the territory.
UNIFIL had now lost control of South Lebanon. Effectively, the Israeli Defense Forces and their surrogates, the Christian SLA, took over the territory. UNIFIL's mission had changed. Now it was primarily to provide humanitarian aid to the locals.
I got great satisfaction from developing the humanitarian support to the Lebanese people on the ground, particularly older people, infirm people, the people who have been left behind.
But UNIFIL's role in supporting the local population left it open to charges of taking sides. The Israelis claimed the Irish contingent had become a little too sympathetic.
I have always had very high regard for the Irish contingent because they're good soldiers, they know what they want. What I think has happened that in those long years in which they were stationed where they were stationed, they grew to have a relationship with the population, which we didn't have. And of course, basically, if you live amongst them, you become identified with what they say and how they operate. So this is human. I may resent it, but it's there.
Very obviously, when one side is in a position to inflict casualties and damage on the other. And I talk of the Israelis and the Israeli surrogate forces, the SLA, who were trained, armed, equipped, and had Israeli presence with them, the SLA, all the time. They were in the role of the aggressors against the local population, as they said, in retaliation for terrorist attacks. Now, our soldiers witnessed that, and very obviously, they did make efforts to alleviate the plight of the local population on a humanitarian basis. That was part of their mission there, and they carried it out.
But the Israelis also claimed that the Irish and other contingents were deliberately failing to stop attacks by the various resistance groups, and they had to make their feelings known to Irish BAT and other UNIFIL commanders.
I was at the time as in the Foreign Ministry as Director General, and I had to do it myself once or twice. Together with the Chief of Staff of our Army, and we called in General Callahan once or twice on that one.
In my experience, and from the UN's position regarding UNIFIL, there was no such thing as being partial to one side or the other. In my experience, this was never a factor.
They were ignoring, sometimes we used to pass on to UNIFIL saying, look, in such and such a sector, we know that you have there armed people. Go and get them. Sometimes they didn't, and we didn't like that.
I think that if there was hard intelligence of that type of nature, the Israelis conducted their own preemptive strikes against that type of hard information. They certainly weren't sharing it with UNIFIL, and I think that it's somewhat misleading to say that they were operating in any way, handing over intelligence to the UNIFIL forces.
During the occupation, the Israelis seized scores of resistance fighters from the Irish Bat area. Their Christian surrogates, the SLA, took their captives to the notorious Al-Qiyam. Hundreds of Lebanese men and women were detained without trial. Torture in the form of electric shocks, daily beatings, sleep deprivation, and long periods of solitary confinement were routine. Thousands suffered. Some died. Israel says the SLA ran Qiyam, but the Israelis ran the SLA. From their compounds along the high ground, the SLA could control much of South Lebanon. When attacked, they would shell the villages from which the resistance fighters came, often with fatal results.
Give our brother eternal life.
If the attack came from near a UNIFIL position, it was shelled too. Dozens of UN peacekeepers were killed by the SLA. The death toll included at least 6 Irish soldiers, prompting strong protest to the SLA's Israeli masters from Irish politicians.
We protested strongly because we felt that they were being funded, trained and equipped by the Israeli army. Now this was done on the basis that the Israelis themselves felt they had to protect their borders, and they took those people on board, people in many cases who wouldn't have been acceptable in any army, in any army with authority or official army.
The SLA, or the South Lebanese Army, was a Lebanese militia. It was commanded by Lebanese, it was manned by there was no Israeli there.
They were uncouth sometimes, they were undisciplined. They did a lot of things that we were saying, my God, this is terrible. You know, we were not always very happy with what they were doing. But they were there, this was their country, their land, their villages, their homes.
You'd have to put responsibility for how they operated on the people who owned, trained, paid, armed and supported them. And this was Israel and the Israeli Defense Forces.
And how did they behave, in your view?
Pretty liberally, I must say. Pretty liberally. And you must get indications of that from the fact that there was indiscriminate shelling of the UNIFIL headquarters, of UNIFIL positions, of villages, open villages, being fired on with artillery and tanks, etc. This was irresponsible carry-on. There's no doubt about that. And dangerous.
You believe that the SLA deliberately targeted civilians and deliberately targeted UNIFIL posts?
Oh, well, I can't interpret what they intended, but what arrived would indicate that a lot of this was aimed fire at villages, posts and near posts and at vital areas.
I recall on one occasion feeling so badly about a certain death that we decided to go down and talk to the then Minister for Defence, Mr. Rabin, who later became Prime Minister and unfortunately was assassinated subsequently. But I recall having a very robust discussion with him on the basis that we understood the South Lebanese Army had caused the death of a soldier at the time. And his attitude, his response to me was, look, we didn't invite you out here. I didn't ask Irish mothers to send their sons to be shot by anybody in the Middle East. And that kind of attitude was prevalent at the time. And I remember objecting very strongly to the kind of attitude and indeed the language used to me as a representative of the Irish government at the time. But then again, that was the kind of attitude prevalent, and it was pretty nasty at the time.
I'm sure that if we were to weigh the achievements of SLA and how many lives, Israeli lives, civilian and military, they saved by mere fact that they were there, you would see that knowing that we have a problem with SLA and discipline and so forth, this was amply compensated by the fact that we could live in this area, in this northern area.
Making northern Israel safer was costly for the Lebanese. Thousands died in the conflict. The IDF occupation and its alliance with the SLA had many opponents within Israel. At one stage, almost 500,000 people protested in Tel Aviv. It was argued that this, unlike all the other wars, was not a defensive action. But the country's military and political leadership maintained it was justified.
When you have a terrorist organization, as the PLO was at that time, firing on our villages in northern Israel, on our kibbutzim, we had very little choice at the time, because the choice would have been to say, okay, we'll say to our citizens, you're going to be shelled and we can't do anything about it. We couldn't do that.
When you are involved in a war, you expect to be involved in a military confrontation. We hit at Israel and the Israelis hit at us.
Civilians?
They hit more civilians, unfortunately, than military in our case.
But you attacked their civilians also?
In my personal view, there is no civilian society in Israel. It's all military society. From day one, all the Israeli society is a military one. They take them when they are young into the army, and they train them, put there in minds that you have an enemy called Palestinians.
There was no chance of peace. Israel and the various forces of resistance did what they felt was necessary. Palestinians, Shia Muslims, communists. It was virtually impossible to know who was who and what they were doing. And it was dangerous to ask.
In peacekeeping, there is no military intelligence system in peacekeeping. And there's a very good reason for it. If you start gleaning intelligence from either of the parties, you become part of the conflict. And you become a target, and probably legitimately so.
But the Irish peacekeepers had to at least develop contacts with the local resistance groups, even if the information they gleaned was unreliable and promises made were soon broken.
When you're dealing with them, you have to accept that there are very serious restrictions and reservations. And then the variety of thinking, beliefs and parties on the ground, vying with each other for turf, territory and power. It becomes extremely difficult to set a system of negotiation and operation.
When the Irish first arrived in 1978, the PLO were the main resistance group. The various Palestinian factions within the PLO had established many bases and were beginning to form a regular army. But they had no long-term plan.
The PLO had no strategy in facing the realities in Lebanon. But we found ourselves in a situation where we cannot but to fight the Israelis. You know, Lebanon, in my view, was like a ship which hijacked by the Palestinians. We have no place, we have no country, and we didn't go to Lebanon because we wanted to go ourselves. We were pushed to go out, and we were forced by the Israeli military and atrocities and massacres to go to Lebanon. But yes, our presence was a heavy burden on the Lebanese government, on the Lebanese people. And that is something which we have to admit. But we have no alternatives.
The PLO had welcomed the UNIFIL mandate, but in practice they ignored it, penetrating the Irish Pat area to attack the Israelis and the SLA.
We did, and I'm not here to deny it. It is a fact, and although it's a past now, it has, situation has changed, but we did. And the Palestinian situation, it's always, as you know, we have different organizations. Some of them, they were not under the PLO control, and they were themselves taking their own initiatives at attacking Israeli targets within Israel and in southern of Lebanon.
Did you see UNIFIL to some degree as an obstacle in that they were stuck in the middle?
They were not an obstacle, but they could not prevent us from going. And they could not prevent the Israelis, because that mandate has that limitation.
The thin blue line separating the Israelis and the Palestinians and the Lebanese was always porous. And as the various sides continued to break the agreement and attack one another, all the UNIFIL force could do was complain. But did the protest or their presence make any difference?
Well, absolutely, it does. It does. UNIFIL's position on the ground does restrain it and limit it. It may not stop it altogether, but the very presence of UN troops on the ground does restrict operations because they have a reporting capacity.
I believe that all the sides in that conflict, and I include the Israelis, would have behaved even more brutally had the UN not been there to witness it. It's very worrying for a soldier who's going to do something bad to realize that another soldier wearing a blue beret who has a camera is going to take a picture of him and record what he does in detail and give it to the press. So the UN had a great deterrent effect by being there.
But by late 1982, when the Israelis drove the PLO all the way up to Beirut, the UN could not be there to prevent what happened. The PLO dug in around the streets of the capital, and knowing that going in after them would result in heavy casualties among the IDF, the Israelis resorted to aerial and artillery bombardment. Thousands died, including many Lebanese civilians. As the PLO finally fled Lebanon, Israel's allies, the Christian Phalange militia, were free to massacre 1,100 Palestinians in Sabra and Shatila. Back in South Lebanon, the PLO had been replaced by the forces of Shiite Muslim resistance. The Amal took the Palestinian weapons, but the Hezbollah, with the help of millions of dollars worth of training and weapons provided by Iran, with the cooperation of Syria, became the dominant force, and a major problem for UNIFIL.
When the Israelis started a partial withdrawal after the massive invasion of Lebanon in '82, UNIFIL decided to throw its lot in with Amal and use Amal, the Shiite militia, which is not Hezbollah, as their liaison point to the Shiite community. And I think that was a big mistake because Hezbollah was at that stage still very secretive and didn't wish to have any connections with the United Nations. But the UN, instead of reaching out to the Hezbollah, reached out to Amal, which was a very venal organization and a very corrupt one. As the years went by, they came to realize that the resistance, in quotation, movement was Hezbollah, not Amal. Amal were sandbags. And so a system of liaising with Hezbollah officials grew up.
Hezbollah were the group responsible for the kidnapping and killing of Western hostages. Fierce opponents of Israeli occupation, they were not to be mollified by any UN resolutions. Fundamentalist by nature, it was also developing a sophisticated political organization, which led to the taking of 8 seats in the Lebanese parliament. But during the occupation, its military wing allowed nothing, including UNIFIL, to get in its way.
UNIFIL was merely a witness to the conflict. It could do nothing. It did not protect our citizens from the Israelis or from their allies. The international peacekeepers did carry out some good work and help our people to survive. However, frequently it was an obstacle for us in our fight to liberate our country from the Israeli forces of occupation.
But part of UNIFIL's task in South Lebanon was to keep their own main supply routes clear of roadside bombs. The bombs were intended for the Israelis or the SLA, but by defusing them, UNIFIL was coming into direct conflict with the Hezbollah. The Irish were warned off. If they ignored the warnings, they were attacked.
حالات قتل ما صارت يعني بسبب المقاومة أو بنيران من المقاومين.
UNIFIL soldiers were dealing with or making safe bombs which resistance fighters had targeted at the Israeli forces of occupation and the South Lebanon army. This is what I mean when I said that sometimes the UNIFIL forces were real obstacles to the resistance in our struggle to liberate our country. But we did not kill any soldiers with the UNIFIL. Sometimes there were accidents and people were killed. And sometimes they were killed by Israeli forces.
But UNIFIL believes Hezbollah was responsible for the deaths of its soldiers, including 3 Irishmen killed in a landmine explosion. The Irish are convinced they had been deliberately targeted by a man working for Hezbollah, and though they knew who had ordered the attack, there was no system of justice to deal with this.
Well, that was part of the weakness in the whole area. The whole infrastructure in South Lebanon had broken down. Policing, judges, the whole lot. And it's not a function of UN to create internment camps. You try to work with the local system and try to develop it.
The Hezbollah frequently used UN positions as cover to launch rocket attacks on nearby South Lebanon army compounds. The SLA would shell UNIFIL in reply. The hope was to force the UN to take action against the Hezbollah, but peacekeepers were often killed in the crossfire.
If we did this, it would only have been in the case of an emergency. It did happen sometimes, but eventually it was stopped altogether. We never deliberately targeted a UNIFIL post, but the Israelis did. Besides, if you were in the middle of a conflict area, because that is what Lebanon was at that time, you must expect casualties.
In April 1996, the use of UN compounds as cover by the Hezbollah led to tragedy. Within minutes of a Hezbollah rocket attack on the SLA, the Israeli Air Force hit back. Their bombs landed on a Fijian UN position to where Lebanese civilians had run for cover. More than 100 people died in Cana. The Israelis have always denied it was a deliberate attack. But the wave of international criticism of that incident and the so-called Operation Grapes of Wrath, of which it was a part, was having an effect. That and the increasing death toll among Israeli soldiers had meant public opinion was swinging against the occupation. By the late 90s, Labour Party leader Ehud Barak promised that if elected, he would pull the Israeli army out of Lebanon. He was swept to power, and in May of last year, the Israelis finally withdrew. The SLA disbanded and fled, some to Europe, some to Israel. With the Israelis gone and a peace of sorts, the UNIFIL mission is being wound down. The Irish contingent is leaving Lebanon for good. After 23 years, 30,000 tours of duty, and 45 deaths and hundreds of injuries, they're finally going home.
You know, this is not a bad time when one should consider a quantification of what has happened, because that agreed withdrawal was not carried out, and what has happened since then, with losses of life to the Lebanese, the Israelis, UNIFIL, Shabran Shatila, you name it. If the withdrawal had taken place as it was agreed to take place in 1978, I am certain that none of this would ever have happened.
There was many wars before that war in Lebanon between the different religious sects in Lebanon. So our presence was not really the reason behind
it. Didn't help,
the war.
though. It didn't help.
It didn't help, yes. But some communities within Lebanon found, with our presence, some kind of strength, if I can put it like that. And they may, directly or indirectly, like to use us in order to consolidate their presence at the expense of the others.
Well, whether willingly or unwillingly,
yeah,
your presence made the whole thing worse.
Possible. Possible.
Indirectly, the Lebanese war did eventually give birth to Oslo, did give birth to the understanding that we try to reach with the Palestinians at a later date.
Why? Because it forced them to look at a political alternative?
Exactly. And it forced the local Palestinians here in the territories to say, okay, the Arab world isn't helping us, the PLO from the outside isn't helping us, we have to take action on our own. They started the Intifada, and they made it very, very clear to themselves and to everybody else that the only possible solution for the Palestinian problem is political, and to sit down with Israel and try to reach a political understanding. Today that's not happening, but it will happen, because it's the only possible way.